There's little argument that the European Union needs to be reformed. Before the last European elections, Nick Clegg said, "My party argues the case for reform in Parliament, in the media, and on the doorsteps every day of the year." Well, maybe he exaggerated a bit there, but it shows that at least even the most pro-EU people say it needs reform. But is it realistically possible? I asked a member of the European Parliament, Roger Helmer, what he thinks you need to create a democratic political system.
You need a group of people who share enough in common in terms of history, culture, language and economic interests that they are prepared, I love this phrase, prepared to accept governance at each other's hands. That is the issue, that the people consent to be governed together.
Okay, so that does kind of make sense. In practical terms, unless people share a common language, how, for example, can political leaders communicate what they're proposing to everyone without us all constantly having to translate into 23 languages everything that's said? And how can the people communicate, discuss and debate their priorities so they understand each other's needs? And unless you have a European media, newspapers and TV channels communicating exactly the same thing to everyone in multiple languages, in the same way, at the same time, how can you really expect people to have shared understanding of what's going on and be able to scrutinise the politicians they elect to make sure they deliver on their promises? Roger goes on to explain one of the key problems.
Our economic interests diverge. You can see with the Euro project that an exchange rate that's good for Germany has been a disaster for Southern Europe.
And that's certainly true. Youth unemployment in Greece is close to 50%. The Italian, Spanish and Portuguese economies are all in trouble. So trying to force different people in different circumstances together is plainly not working. With very different economic circumstances, surely those priorities are going to be very different for different countries. How can one size fit all? So do you simply have to conclude that so many exceptions would have to be made for different people that you're better off having self-governing democracies who work in close cooperation where they have common interests? And aren't these questions the central issue here? The EU isn't governing with the consent of the people. We've never voted to say we want to be governed by the EU. But despite this, it repeatedly imposes laws in a huge range of areas where democratically elected national governments should be making the laws.
Look at the response of the European institutions, for example, to referenda. They have a mountainous contempt for the view of the public. If the public vote the wrong way, the answer is go away, vote again until you get the right answer. The Danes, the Irish, and even with the Constitution, what was that, about 10 years ago, the French and the Dutch, thank God, voted against it. It didn't go away. They just took the same document, changed the name and said, right, it's a treaty now, it's not a constitution, so we don't need a referendum.
So, can you democratically reform something that ignores the popular consent of the people and whose unelected officials, who drive the lawmaking process, don't face the risk of getting sacked by the people if they don't do what we want them to do? How could that work?
Again and again, we would vote for particular measures which would damage employment opportunities, which would cost jobs. And sometimes I would go to some of the other MEPs afterwards and say, why did you vote for that? You'll lose jobs in your country, your voters will lose their jobs. And they would say, oh, come on, Roger, we know you think like that, but actually we're building Europe. We've put another brick in the European construction. This is what we're here to do.
As we explored in the previous video, the unelected European Commission, who introduce all the laws, have a clearly stated objective of creating a European superstate, or empire as others call it. And the European Parliament, which only has limited powers and cannot introduce legislation, also has a majority of members who are committed to the same ideal.
How do you get elected to the European Parliament? At some point, you put up your hand, probably in a political meeting, and say, I'd like to be considered as a candidate. Why do you do that? For the great majority of people, in the great majority of parties, it's because they're passionately keen on the European project. So, overwhelmingly, the members of the European Parliament, obviously with exceptions like UKIP, we're there for a different reason, but the great majority are passionately in favour of the project. And the best example I can give you is, again, going back to the European Constitution 10 years ago. That was voted on in the Parliament. I haven't got the exact figures, but something like 90% of the French MEPs and something like 90% of the Dutch MEPs voted in favour. When it got to the referendum in their respective countries, I think it was 57% of the French people voted against and 62 or 3% of the Dutch voted against. A complete mismatch between the reaction of the elected MEPs in Brussels and the views of the people out there in the country. And that, I think, illustrates the lack of democratic accountability.
But how can they get away with it? Well, can you even name all the MEPs that represent the region you live in the UK? Almost no one can. And have you any idea what they're voting on today, tomorrow, next week? Again, it's the remoteness from us, the lack of shared language and media, and the entirely undemocratic nature of the powerful European Commission, not simply the fact that the UK only has a small proportion of votes in the relatively weak European Parliament that causes the issue. So ultimately, can the EU be reformed? Well, we know from history how things can eventually turn out when an elite, even one that was democratically elected, ignores and subverts the will of the people. This happened in Germany in the 1930s and in Italy. The voices of the reformers inside were ignored or eventually crushed. It all ended very badly indeed before change was won at a cost of millions of lives. But Roger has a different and more hopeful proposition. A bloodless revolution, no less.
When we leave, we will be seen to be doing so much better and free to do useful things that member states in the European Union can't do. I am sure that a number of member states, especially in Northern Europe, will be saying, well, if Britain can do it, we can do it. Yeah. They may go exactly the same route, or at least they may seek a very different relationship within the European Union. I think that our leaving could transform the whole thing. And my ideal objective is I want to see a Europe of democratic nations trading and voluntarily cooperating as independent nations with each other. That is the kind of democratic Europe that I would like to see. I think that we can stimulate that, we can start that process by leaving, and to quote an ancient statesman, we can save ourselves by our exertions and we can save Europe by our example.
Is he right? Well, that largely depends on us. But I certainly take the point that as the EU continues to grab more power from national governments, we are less and less likely to be able to turn back the tide. So at some point we have to make a stand. And as we only seem to get the opportunity to do so once in a generation or more, it would seem that it falls to us to make that stand, to restore our own democracy, and if ultimately we want to play a positive role in reforming the way that European nations work democratically together. Thanks for watching. See you next time.